Okay. So, hello and welcome to today's Info2Go webinar. My name is Annie Gaines. I'm the continuing education consultant here at the Idaho Commission for Libraries, located in windy Boise, Idaho. Our webinars and other continuing education opportunities are funded by the Institute of Museum and Library Services. Everyone is muted, and we encourage you to use the chat feature to ask questions and discuss with other attendees. As you exit the webinar, you'll be prompted to complete an evaluation. And as always, we appreciate your honest feedback. Today's topic is about privacy literacy, and our presenter is Ross Sempek, a reference librarian at the College of Southern Idaho, located in Twin Falls. Thanks so much for being here, Ross, to share about this topic. So take it away.
Cool. Well, thanks so much for having me, Annie. I really appreciate you guys and Idaho Commission for Libraries for putting this on. I appreciate all of you for having an interest in this topic. It's something I'm very passionate about, as you will soon find out, I'm sure. So, from sort of like an academic standpoint, I feel like this is the best. I'm in an academic library. This is the best way for me to conceptualize this privacy literacy as information literacy, because it really is. And we'll sort of get into that today. So, I'll give you a little background about myself. I've been in libraries for about 8 years. I graduated with my degree in 2018, and I had the great privilege of writing for the ALA Office for Intellectual Freedom blog. When I was in library school, I was really struck by intellectual freedom and privacy's role in intellectual freedom, and so this was something that just really drove me so much so to write about it. And for one of the posts that I wrote, I wanted to explore the history of the internet. I wanted to exercise my information literacy and find out more about this topic, right? And so I came across this book called Surveillance Valley: Secret Military History of the Internet, and was very intrigued by the subtitle there. And after that, it just sent me down a rabbit hole of discovery of privacy, of surveillance, of military industrial complex. And so it just sent me down this wacky road of crazy reads. So learned about drone surveillance with eyes in the sky. Came across The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, which, if you're at all interested in privacy and have not read, this is a must read. It's a very thick and dense book, but Zuboff is really good. Is an excellent writer and makes it very engaging in a quick read. Did a deep dive into DARPA, even got into some crazy stuff like psychic soldiers with the men who stare at goats, and then of course went down the CIA MK Ultra mind control LSD rabbit hole. So that's sort of where I'm at, and the research that I've done. This is just kind of like scratching the surface of all the things that I'm into. But so we're gonna get into some privacy literacy today, and I one thing I want to make abundantly clear is that I'm not here to judge anybody or anything that they do. When I was part of this library privacy literacy cohort, there's a spectrum, right? There's privacy nihilists and privacy vegans. Privacy vegans are like just want nothing to do with the surveillance economy. Privacy nihilists are like, well, I have nothing to hide argument, right? Whatever, I might as well just go along with it. So it exists on a spectrum. Wherever you are in that spectrum is whatever. It's totally fine. In fact, um, I'll probably go against all of my advice today. I've gone against it before because, as we'll see, to stay on top of everything privacy related is nearly impossible. But to me, that doesn't mean it's not worth doing, because nothing in this world is absolute. So if you feel strongly about something, you might as well work towards that end. So I'm not here to judge, but I'm here to illuminate, and I hope that you walk out of here with a better understanding of the privacy landscape that defines our modern existence. So in order to do that, we'll cover a few topics. I will define privacy and surveillance capitalism. We'll dive into the history of the internet and how that history informs the current landscape of your digital footprint. And finally, we'll end with steps you can take to minimize your digital footprint. So I'm sure in your daily lives you have seen pop-ups like these, right? This is something we deal with all the time. And one thing I think that's important to note, and something that I'm sure you have recognized about these, that these are designed for you to click accept, right? They're designed for you to ignore all of the information that you can learn about privacy policies and just click accept and cede your consent without actually providing informed consent. So you can see the accept buttons are highlighted. The areas where you can manage things or control things are located on the bottom left. We in the West read from left to right, so we're most likely to ignore that or not even see it. They have links to give you information on these things, but they're pushing you to just accept, to submit, right? In more definitions than one. So this is sort of like a foundational, sort of gross aspect of the design of these privacy policies. Essentially, what they're trying to do is keep the stuff hidden, but they keep it hidden by designing you to not read them, but it's also hidden in plain sight by a bunch of boring and long privacy policies. So yeah, I've read many privacy policies, and one thing I think that is useful for us to do when thinking about these issues is to sort of reconceptualize what these things are through intentional choice of words. So privacy policies, they're not really privacy policies. Whenever you read a privacy policy, they say, "Oh, we respect your privacy," and then they go on to list all the ways that they violate your privacy, right? So they're not about privacy, they're about surveillance. So essentially, there's a surveillance policies, and I think conceptualizing that will really sort of hopefully get you to think about these things in different ways, right? So let's talk about our core topics today, information literacy and privacy literacy. As I'm sure you all know, the definition of information literacy, but we'll just say it just as a foundational aspect here. I got this from the Dictionary of Information and Library Management. Information literacy, the ability to find relevant information for a particular situation or problem, and to interpret that information effectively. I'd venture to add that one's ability to parse out quality information from bad information, as well as curiosity and critical thinking, are key components of information literacy as well. And so privacy literacy, this is from me, this is my definition of privacy literacy. It's the information you must know in order to give informed consent to using an array of digital platforms and services. So both are about information, both are about knowing, both are about knowledge. And in our digital age, privacy literacy, information literacy, they're really one and the same. When you consume information digitally, then privacy literacy is an inextricable part of your information literacy. Your quest for information in the digital space involves various prompts for you to consent to myriad policies and conditions that implicate your privacy. So, in addition to the privacy information immediately available with these surveillance policies, I feel like understanding the business model of surveillance capitalism as well as the history of the internet are foundational to a holistic concept of what it means to interact with internet-based information. But essentially, to me, it really just comes down to consent. It's about what these privacy policies do and these cookie policies do is they recontextualize, redefine our idea of what consent is. This word comes up a lot in these prompts, and I think what we're used to in the traditional sense of the word consent, it's like positive consent, right? Like you're giving consent to somebody else to engage in a voluntary exchange. And what this does is it flips it on its head. It's like negative consent. They say, we're going to do these things to you, whether you like it or not. And if you don't like it, then just don't use the service, right? There's no middle ground. There's no negotiation to come to an agreed upon like terms that's beneficial for both parties. It's not. So consent is absolutely being destroyed. And I've taken some screenshots of some of the wilder cookie consent notices I've seen. And this is what I mean. They're literally redefining consent. So you have some cookie notices where you have no choice. All these cookies are always active. You cannot toggle these on or off. Yet they tell you you're consenting to these. And they tell you that you have a choice when you don't. It's like Orwellian doublespeak or stuff, right? Like it's really, really crazy. So ultimately, like it's about privacy, it's about information literacy, but consent is a really, really key component of all of this, right? And I feel like this is why it's so important. It's a dangerous precedent to seek consent when you don't actually know what you're consenting to. It's a dangerous precedent to cede cognition of information when you haven't actually understood the resource, right? And all of this happens under the banner of surveillance capitalism, which we'll get to, but a necessary component of that business model is to keep you in the dark about their business practices. So they'll sell you on one thing while the true purpose is another thing entirely, which is really generally pretty dark stuff. And so you'll find this a lot with these surveillance technologies and surveillance capitalism is this duplicitous nature of these offerings, right? And so speaking of duplicity, I kind of like to look at it as like an iceberg, right? So let's say you're just kind of cruising along the surface. You're using these technologies And this is how they're sold to you, right? So we have like stuff like Google, social media, GPS, an array of apps that you can use for these things. They say you can just browse the internet. We foster connection across the globe. You can get driving directions. You can go on a date. You can meet your life partner, and it'll provide you with endless hours of entertainment. They're sold as these technologies are for you, right? But the truth is a lot different. Here's what's going on beneath the surface, and these are the things that you will learn if you dive deep into privacy literacy, privacy policies, and surveillance policies, excuse me. So there's government surveillance, behavioral modification, social engineering, depression and addiction by design, censorship, profiling, data brokers, unethical experimentation. In reality, these technologies exploit us. And so I think this is something that we need to focus on in order to move forward with this topic. So, so, so this is kind of like what we're talking about, right? The way they hide this information is behind really long and boring privacy policies, and this is by design. For example, if you read The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, she talks about these privacy policies. So she says, quote, legal experts call privacy policies contracts of adhesion because they impose take it or leave it conditions that on users that stick to them whether they like it or not. We mentioned this earlier. For example, in 2008, ages ago, two Carnegie Mellon professors calculated that a reasonable reading of all the privacy policies that one encounters in a year would require 76 full work days. So I did the math. I multiplied 8 hours by 76. That's 608 hours. And if you work full time, you're only left with 28 weekend days, 8-hour shifts out of the year to devote to anything other than work or reading privacy policies or cooking, cleaning, sleeping. It's absurd, right? Like this is what I talked about earlier, that it's nearly impossible to keep up with this stuff just because it's so replete. Um, and this is how it happens, right? So one company like Meta will have one privacy policy, but then they have an array of third parties that have their own privacy policy. These third parties work with other third parties that have their privacy policies as well, and that it just exponentially grows to the point where just to give informed consent for one service requires an intense amount of effort. So this is how it works, right? And imagine this. This was from 2008, nearly 20 years ago, and we can extrapolate how much that has grown in the nearly 2 decades since the study, right? So, for example, let's take LinkedIn as an example, and we'll revisit LinkedIn later here. Their combined terms and conditions, privacy policy, cookies policy, and all the associated links, the hyperlinked information within these policies equates to a whopping 70,000 plus words. This is otherwise known as a novel. So just to provide, and it's not even informed consent. You don't know everything about what they're doing. They expect you to read a novel during your day-to-day existence. It's nuts. It's at best Kafkaesque. And so part of what I was researching when I was writing for the blog is how did we get here? This is insane. Like I grew up um, born in 84, grew up in the 90s, saw the rise of the internet. I was really curious about, well, how did we get here? What was the path? So we'll get into that, but before we do that, we'll sort of describe privacy as it's defined very basically by law. And I'm sure all of you guys know this stuff, right? But we'll just go over it just to provide foundation for our argument. So if you're outdoors, you're in the public space, you're in this shared space that we all get to call our own, you have a low expectation of privacy. And this is for a few reasons. It's because you've decided to go outside into the shared space sometimes, right? If you're a person experiencing homelessness, you don't have much of a choice. But most of us go out to this place. And if somebody happens to take a photo and you're in it incidentally, that's fine because you're in the public space. If somebody walks by you and happens to hear a snippet of your conversation, that's whatever, right? Because you're in the public space doing these things, you should expect a low amount of privacy. By comparison, you should have a high expectation of privacy in your private space, right? This is your space. You got four walls, a roof. You can pull the blinds, pull the shades, restrict access to people you don't want in there, give access to people you do want in there. And this is sort of modern society has been built on this contrast between public and private. And I feel like it keeps people sane. It keeps me sane for sure. But the problem with the internet is that it blurs these lines. The internet is this virtual public space. And this is problematic to privacy. Nothing you do on the internet is entirely private, sadly. It's an area where all of your information is tracked, cataloged, and traced. And what we're expected to do in this modern age is to have invite a virtual public space into our private space. And so this blurs these lines and it sort of messes with our definition of what we used to consider public and private. Um, and so this is what it might look like. Speaking of like recontextualizing how we look at these technologies, I think it's really helpful to imagine how we might react if all these like privacy violations that occur on a daily basis were actually to happen at the hands of like a person, like a stranger you didn't know, right? So like for example, if that lady in the park were to enter your apartment, start recording you and recording your conversation, I would assume most of us would be like, what are you doing here? I don't know you. How did you get in here? Please leave. I don't want you here, right? This is an obvious violation of your privacy. But what if the same surveillance occurred, but we remove the person from the equation and put in her place modern technology? Perhaps you really like technology, you have a bunch of like high-tech gadgets in your home, including these things. So, for example, with a cell phone, if you have a voice assistant on, it is constantly listening to you. This is how it responds to your requests. And if you have an internet browser and you use the internet and it's not a privacy forward internet browser, your internet history, social media information, purchasing practices, purchasing preferences, and so much more is cataloged on this thing. If you have a voice assistant like Alexa, again, just like a voice assistant on your phone, it is constantly listening to you in order to respond to your queries. I actually wanted to learn more about this, so I went to Amazon's like privacy surveillance policy about Alexa. So they claim that its listening recording technology is so advanced that it doesn't actually hear any of the things you say unless you say like an activation phrase, right? But so A, I don't believe them. B, even if that were true, they can glean a lot of information from the sounds that occur inside of your home without even having to know what's being said, right? So for example, you open and shut the door to leave your house and to come back in, so they know your schedule. They know when you come and go. If you have an Alexa in your bedroom and you are being intimate with your partner and you happen to be making some noise at, 11 or 12 in the morning, I think that Amazon can glean what's going on, right? So they don't need to hear exactly what you're saying in order to spy on you, right? For example, we have a Wi-Fi router. If you have an internet connected at home, this is just a way to connect to the internet, right? But not quite. Carnegie Mellon University researchers have recently found a way to use Wi-Fi radiation to see through walls and to track your movement within your own home. It basically analyzes Wi-Fi waves as radars and sees what it bounces off of and analyzes that with artificial intelligence in order to create like an image, right? Or a Roomba. Let's say you have a Roomba. It's just a vacuum. Not really. Roombas record their own movements and map out your home's interior, namely where you have furniture, what kind of furniture you have, your home square footage, and how many rooms you have. If you have a TV like a lot of us, and you have a smart TV, because it's nearly impossible to get a dumb TV anymore, this is recording a lot of stuff. So if you have a streaming service like Netflix or Hulu, I can pretty much guarantee this information about your viewing preferences is cataloged, shared, and sold to advertisers. Some TVs like Vizio emit a Wi-Fi signal, so the TV itself is like is an internet router, and so this allows it to harvest information communicated across the internet and across the Internet of Things. Vizio's TV not only does this, but it catalogs the information, images from your streaming services, also DVDs and cable TV shows that you watch. So everything that you watch on a Vizio TV, they take and use that for their surveillance capitalist needs. And honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if your cat's spying on you too, right? Or it's that crazy nowadays. So this is the climate of modern surveillance technology. Companies engaging in this behavior, they have zero respect for your private space. In fact, they see your private space as a resource that they can tap to make money without paying you a dime in the process. Your lived experience is a commodity at this point. So here we've sort of talking about continuing the dual nature or duplicity of these business practices, right? And the scale of the surveillance, it's only possible with the internet. So we're going to shift to dive into the history of this utility, a brief history of the internet, very brief. It gets a lot deeper than this, but the internet was originally an idea thrown around by United States defense wonks during the Cold War, Cold War, lots of fear of nuclear holocaust and all that stuff. But more importantly, they were fearful that communication channels might be interrupted. And during any conflict, the ability to communicate is really represents your ability to defeat the enemy, right? So that's why these communication channels are frequent targets during armed conflict. So they were scared that like if we only have an A to B communications channel and one of those is interrupted, then we have no ability to communicate, right? So what if there were a variety of nodes connected by a singular network, right? And if one of those nodes were destroyed, you could still use the other nodes to communicate. This was sort of the germ, the original idea of the internet. Nothing was done beyond that until another wartime theater came along, and we get the creation of ARPA, right? So this is the ARPANET was the progenitor of the early internet. ARPA stands for Advanced Research Projects Agency. This is a Pentagon-funded arm of the Department of Defense. Their original charge was to they were in the space program for the U.S. government. So when Sputnik happened, they were sort of like worked with other agencies to see how they couldn't respond to that. After their usefulness was expended there, they were moved on to missile defense, and then after that, they got thrust into the conflict in Vietnam in the 60s and the 70s. And so what Vietnam was essentially a giant laboratory for the Department of Defense to test their ideas about counterinsurgency. And so Kennedy was really concerned with the threat of communism and the spread of communism all around the globe. And this was like a global threat. So he couldn't necessarily have troops everywhere. It would be spread thin. And so the idea was how can we fight and win wars without mass casualties and without expending our troop capabilities? Like, oh, well, we can use technology, right? And so they used Vietnam as a laboratory to see how they can use technology in order to fight and win wars. And as a result of all of their use of technology, they produced just a massive amount of information. And so it was okay, it was fine and dandy to analyze and use that information in real time in Vietnam, but they really wanted to be able to share that information in real time overseas. And they said, well, how do we do this? We need to have a network of computers. And so this eventually led to the creation of the ARPANET. They never were able to use the ARPANET during Vietnam, but it was created during that time. And so ARPA contracted private companies and universities to build the technology. This is a pretty standard approach by the federal government. They don't want to build stuff from scratch. If it's pre-existing, then we might as well use that, right? So this sort of made these companies and universities beholden to the federal government, not only the federal government, but the military industrial complex. And so places like Stanford, MIT, UCLA were involved in creating the ARPANET, for example. Some quotidian things that we all use every day, the hyperlink and the mouse, these were created under ARPA contract at the Stanford Research Institute. So it's pretty wild to think that the mouse you use to scroll around has deep ties to the military industrial complex. So eventually, the US government ran out of funding for the ARPANET. They basically said, if you guys want to keep this project going, you can sell it to private companies and then go from there. So the quote unquote backbone of the internet was built. The creators of this backbone then sold access to private companies who then sold the utility back to the American public. And this is also a pretty common model of the federal government, is that you use public funds to build a utility and then charge the people who funded that a fee to use it. It's pretty wild. So yeah, that's the history of the internet. That's how we kind of came to today. But there's a lot that happened in between. First of all, ARPA changed its name to DARPA to really hit home that we're about defense, right? So Defense Advanced Research Project Agencies. And then DARPA is, you'll find them really active in the Bay Area. And so more specifically in Stanford and in Palo Alto, California. So back in the late 90s, early 2000s, you had the founders of Google, Sergey Brin and Larry Page, attending Stanford University, working on their doctoral thesis. And their main project was a project to index the internet. And so we have Stanford Research Institute that funded their project to index the internet. And DARPA was one of the main funders of Stanford Research Institute. And through my research, I found that SRI is like basically a civilian arm of the Department of Defense. It is completely replete with folks tied to all sorts of like wartime three-letter agencies, and so it's a way for the Department of Defense to exert influence over lots of different policies, especially technology, and technology is huge in the Bay Area, right? Um, Speaking of Google and the federal government, that's not the only tie they have. They have a really cozy relationship with the government. So Google contracted for the NSA and the CIA, bringing their search technology to both of these agencies. Eric Schmidt, the then Google CEO, had a leading role in the Obama 2008 election campaign. He was like the person who headed the think tank for like electioneering. And what he did was he was able to leverage Google's analytics and behavioral prediction to augment the election campaign. And during this time, Obama's campaign team and Google was a revolving door. So you would have Google employees go to work for the Obama election campaign, and then Obama staffers come over to work in Google. So not only does Google and the federal government have this relationship, but they have this sort of like incestuous trade of workforces. Google Maps, this is something most of us may use. It originally was a company called Keyhole. Keyhole was a video game company in the Bay Area. Keyhole was funded by In-Q-Tel. In-Q-Tel is a CIA venture capitalist firm, and Google got wind of this technology. They bought Keyhole. Keyhole was eventually, I'm sorry, and then turned into Google Maps. Google Maps was eventually used in the war in Iraq after 2001. And along with the purchase of Keyhole, they also acquired a CIA employee who acted as a liaison to federal government employees. And one more tie with DARPA, one of the DARPA heads, her name was Regina Dugan. She had a pretty brief stint as head, but after she left DARPA, she went on to work for Google. And then after Google, she went to work for Facebook. So these things are not coincidental. These things are um, uh, happen for a reason, and it's because of these really deep ties of big tech to the federal government, not only the federal government, but to the military industrial complex. So I mentioned Google mostly because they're, pretty much a monopoly at this point. A lot of people um, equate Google with the internet, right? And this is because they are the first people to engage in the practice of surveillance capitalism. And this is something that Shoshana Zuboff has coined. It's a completely new business model in which you can probably glean from its title, people make money off of surveillance, but it's a lot deeper than that. So let's define surveillance capitalism here. So for a contrast, I like to offer a traditional capitalist model, right? It certainly can get a little more complex than this. And capitalism is not without its issues, right? But here's how it works. As a customer, you earn wages through your production of labor. You use those wages to purchase a product or service from a business. It's a pretty simple two-way street, and it's mutually beneficial generally, right? With surveillance capitalism, the big shift is that the people using the products, us, we're no longer the customer. We are the user. And this is a very intentional shift in linguistics, right? So, and this is how it works, right? You're the user, you're granted free access to all of these products, social media, email, internet, browsers, that sort of thing. And we supply information without being paid for our labor. The information is called behavioral surplus by Shoshana Zuboff. The information that they gather is surveilled, it's analyzed by artificial intelligence, and then it's sold to advertisers. Advertisers are the true customers in this exchange of surveillance capitalism. And then after that, advertisers bet on your purchasing behavior based off of this surveillance. And what's wild is that the commodity is not the platforms themselves, but your lived experience is what's being bought and sold in this market. That's what surveillance capitalism is about. And it also involves these folks called data brokers. So data brokers gather your personal information from many sources in order to create a profile of you and sell it to companies and governments. So they'll get stuff like surveys, government records, shopping habits, social media stuff, browser history, location information, email, and other communication, and gather that into a profile of you. This profile is known as your digital double, and this is an aggregate of all your lived experience on the internet-enabled devices, websites, apps, software, and sometimes external sources as well. So surveillance capitalists run simulations on your digital double to determine odds of you clicking on an ad. This is how it works. So those odds are then delivered to advertisers for them to wager on what Zuboff calls behavioral futures. or how you will behave in the future, right? Kind of like futures in the stock market. They make predictions off of how it will go and make money or lose money based off of those predictions. So with Google, for example, advertisers will bet on your inclination to click on one of their ads. The advertisers deliver these odds. If the advertiser likes those odds, they will bet on your future clicks. And if they guess correctly and you click on an ad, then Google gets paid. This is what happens in the milliseconds in between you performing a search and getting search results. All this is this sort of behavioral future embedding is going on, and that's how you get ads show up at the top of your screen. So you're much more likely to buy something after clicking on an ad. This is why it's so powerful and popular. Just as you're much more likely to buy something after you've entered a business. So this is that market. But it gets more complex than that. There's an expanded market. So the advertisers gain this information through their dealings with social media companies, through surveillance capitalists, and they can become a business themselves, right? And they have this information that they can sell to other businesses, which are called data brokers. And data brokers do business with not only other businesses, but with governments across the world. So this is how, for example, in the US, that the government can launder illegal surveillance through purchasing your information legally from a third party on the open market. So information that they would otherwise need a warrant for, they can just buy from data brokers. It's pretty wild. And so here's sort of like a zoomed out view of how this all works. We're sapped of our information. It gets sold to Facebook, sold to advertisers, gets sold to data brokers, gets sold to governments who pay for that information with our taxes. It is a pretty bleak existence. But again, if this is what Google or Meta led with, I'm convinced nobody would actually use the platform. So they have to sort of tell you a half truth or a lie that like, oh yeah, this is Facebook's all about fostering connection across the globe. It's not, right? Um, so one of Zuboff's anchoring theses or points in her book is that surveillance capitalism is all about behavioral modification in pursuit of profit. What surveillance capitalists do, again, right, is run a simulation on a digital double to predict whether or not you will click on an ad. Their ultimate goal is to use these same practices to modify your purchasing behavior in favor of the highest bidder. So not only predictions, but modifications. This is what it means to eliminate market uncertainty. What they and their advertising customers are working toward is a way to guarantee that you will buy a thing. So what if they didn't have to bet on the odds that you will buy a thing? What if the probability of you buying a product was 100%? This is their audacious goal, and this is their motivation to modify your behavior. This ties into B.F. Skinner, who's highly cited throughout this book, and in particular his philosophical treatise on what it means to be a human, Beyond Freedom and Dignity. I just finished reading this book, and it's pretty wild take on what it means to be human. Basically, what he's saying is that Skinner calls for the creation of a technology of behavior, is what he calls it, in order to solve all the world's ills. His take is that our concepts of freedom and dignity are actually bad. They have created the world's problems, right? So we need to get rid of these ideologies. We need to get rid of freedom. We need to get rid of dignity in order in favor of a system of behavioral control that will ensure goodness. No more war, no more violence, no more crime. So his vision is like a utopia via behavioral modification. So if you ask me, we have that now, but its implementation is not utopian. It is dystopian. He argues that this technology of behavior can work in the real world just as it works in the lab. Maybe not so, but we have these labs. The labs are Facebook. The labs are Google. The labs are stuff like Pokemon Go, which Zuboff covers in her book, and it's pretty wild stuff. So, yeah, they all operate as these technologies of behavior. These are ways like labs. And for example, Facebook will regularly runs experiments, social experiments on its users to see what it can and can't do to modify people's behavior. And this is all without their knowledge. So it's like incredibly unethical, but they're allowed to do this. And for example, with Pokemon Go, it's pretty wild. At its core, it's a gamification of behavior modification, right? So with profits as the end goal. If you've ever seen like a group of people play this game, they're all looking at their phones and they all look like a herd of people being guided by a game, right? And so not only are they able to just like tell people where to go and tell them where to put their phones. But if you're in a business, you can lure people into your business and maybe have them spend more money. So one quote from the Age of Surveillance Capitalism is the owner of a pizza bar in Queens, New York, paid about $10 for lure modules, successfully producing virtual creatures on bar stools and in bathroom stalls. During the first weekend of gameplay, the bar's food and drink sales shot up by 30% and were later reported to be 70% above average. So it's pretty wild that not only can they modify your behavior online, but their goal is to modify your behavior in the physical world in space time. It's pretty nuts, right? So that's kind of what we're dealing with here. Ultimately, what I want you to take from this presentation, these apps and services, they're not for us at all, primarily. They're merely ways for advertisers and data brokers and governments to surveil, predict, and modify our behavior. But if that's what they had led with, nobody would use these things. And so they need to find other ways, other services to get us to use it. So let's see what sorts of things are in these privacy policies, and then we'll go over things you can do to combat these wild things. So we'll take LinkedIn, for example, right? If you just read one of their paragraphs, and we'll sort of exercise our information literacy here to learn more about what exactly they're talking about, you don't even get past the first sentence, and you say like, "Oh, there's a cookie policy. This is hyperlinked phrase. Let's click on that and learn some more." All right, cool. So we're brought to cookie policy, 1,500 more words that has a bunch of maybe arcane phrases like mobile advertising ID. Well, what is this? Maybe you go off into another website, learn more about that. Cool. Go back. Oh, some more hyperlink stuff. Cookie tables, interesting. All right. We have 4,500 more words. And after all that, they just list some of the cookies, not all of them, right? So your ability to give informed consent is impossible at this point. But we continue reading just because we want to learn some more. At the end of the paragraph, they say stuff about living outside the designated countries. This is the European Union as the designated countries. They have the GDPR, which is pretty strict privacy regulations over there. This is what they do. They also collect or rely on others who collect information about your device where you have not engaged with our services. And so this is one of the things Zuboff talks about in her book is that like this information is not directly related to LinkedIn's practices whatsoever, but they just grab it. They just declare it as their own and call it good, right? And this is the type of information they glean: ID, IP address, operating system, browser information. A lot of vague language in these privacy policies. So browser information, what does that mean? Does it mean just the browser I use? Does it mean my browser history? Is it somewhere in between? We don't know because they don't detail what exactly that means. And there's no way, at least from this privacy surveillance policy, excuse me, to see what they mean. And then this is why they do that. This is a favor for you. They're doing this with you in mind. So we can provide our members, not customers, with relevant ads and better understand their effectiveness. Okay, great. It's not as if we're clamoring for more relevant ads, right? Like, please, LinkedIn, give me more relevant ads. No, they provide relevant ads because the more relevant the ad is, the more likely members are to click on it, and thus the more money they make off the ads. This is called cross-context behavioral advertising, but that doesn't have the same ring to it. Of course, you can opt out. They give you this illusion of autonomy here. And I think the sort of standard of opting out is pretty wild because um, there's a reason it's a standard. If you had the ability to opt into all of these things, I'm convinced nobody would do this because there's no direct benefit for you opting into these surveillance technologies. The benefit lies solely with these surveillance capitalists. You gain nothing from it other than a use of a platform or a service, right? And so the default is to opt out to have you, the default is to have you opt in, and then you have to take great strains to opt out of all these things. But even if you opt out of using data and cookies, you're not opting out of being tracked. You're opting out of them using this information for advertising, right? So you're still being tracked, but you don't even know what they're using this stuff for. They're just saying like, oh, we'll get rid of the ads for you, and that's it. So some misdirection there for you. And then these legal disclosures are always super creepy. This is how they share information with government agencies. And so they go, okay, cool. We'll do this. We'll disclose information when required by law, subpoena, or other legal processes. It's vague. They don't expound on that, what that means at all. Or they throw that all aside if they have a good faith belief that disclosure is necessary. For you to believe that, you have to trust these people, and I simply don't, right? And even at that, at the end of the day, they don't promise to challenge every demand. It's because they get so many demands for this information, they just literally can't, right? So you go on, you see some more hyperlinked phrases, including transparency report. Cool. Transparency. Awesome. Sounds great. Sounds positive. Maybe not so. At least like they're transparent to a fault. This is pretty wild stuff, right? So this is just from last year for 6-month period. 438 requests within about 180 days. This is over 2 requests per day, each request involving over 5 accounts on average. This is they're saying they're a platform for government surveillance. This is what they are, right? So this is LinkedIn for you. So a lot of bad stuff, a lot of doom and gloom. However, there's lots of things that you can do in order to protect your privacy online. I would say at the very least, these are things that I do for myself. Read privacy policies, install an ad blocker, or you can use an internet browser that has that as the default. So Firefox is one of those. Brave is one of those. Those are pretty good browsers. And for me, things recording my location movements is like the creepiest thing ever. So disabling location services is definitely a good thing that you can do. Some more things that we can talk about is the difference between privacy and security. Sometimes they're the same, sometimes they're not. For example, with Google, it's secure. It's like they're the sort of the bellwether for security as far as like preventing bad actors and malware and viruses getting into your email and stuff like that. But they're not private at all, right? Because they're surveillance capitalists. iPhone and iOS, these are highly secure as well. Even sometimes they're encrypted, but they're not private. They're not surveillance capitalists, but Apple regularly complies with information requests from law enforcement and the government. And then when we're using Wi-Fi, this is pretty basic stuff you guys already know, I'm sure. Using a VPN is great, or a password protected router. Use caution when on an unsecured network, of course. Some ways you can keep your information secure, updating your phone and software regularly, or even your computer. Software updates are meant to generally patch holes in security issues. Rebooting your devices is something you can do. And then removing unused apps and accounts. What these apps will do most of the time, including Angry Birds, which is something that's covered in Zuboff's book, is that it's called a leaky app because when you open it, it will it will get information from all the other apps that you have on your phone just by some sort of weird technological sort of trick. And so expect like most of your apps to do this. So if you're not using an app, just delete it, get rid of it. And not only delete the app, but delete the profile if that's something that you if you're like a part of a social media or dating app or something like that. Deleting the app does not get rid of your information. You need to delete your profile. Password managers are a really good thing to use, and creating unique, complex passwords for each one of your accounts is definitely necessary. Here are some good ones for you to use. Multi-factor authentication is also great. Some of these MFAs are default for a lot of services like paying bills and that sort of thing. And then instead of doing like just a 5-digit code for unlocking your phone, an alphanumeric code is something that you can do in settings. And keeping your information private is a little different, right? So using privacy-oriented internet browsers and search engines is great. Brave and Firefox are good. Brave makes its money through offering like rewards for people looking at ads. Firefox makes most of its money from Google, sadly, as they offer Google as a default search engine. This is something you can change though in the settings. You can change it to DuckDuckGo. DuckDuckGo is cool. They still, I mean, again, nothing's absolute. You can't escape all of this surveillance, sadly, especially if you're using the internet. But DuckDuckGo's business model is to serve you ads based off of your search query, the text you use. That's it. They don't create a profile of you. They don't collect your data. They don't run simulations on it with AI. All they do is serve you an ad based off of your search. And that's something I can live with, right? Installing ad blockers is great. End-to-end encryption is amazing. Signal is a really good app. They make their money through like grants and donations. Um, Proton is a good email. And this is what I like about Proton. Like you can pay for the service. You can pay for privacy instead of just getting the service for free and then paying with your information. So I really like that model. They also offer a free email as well. And then iMessage is also encrypted. The information is only encrypted if the other person uses this service. So like if you send an email from Proton to a Gmail account, Google then has your information, right? This is essentially how end-to-end encryption works. You have a code, and the person receiving your information has a key to unlock it. Cell phone provider doesn't see anything. A VPN is essentially like end-to-end encryption for your web browsing, right? So without a VPN, you're sort of putting on display public what you're doing. Your ISP can see this. Lots of other people can see this, but with the VPN, it provides like a tunnel for this information and encrypts this information so nobody but the VPN provider can see this. So knowing this, somebody has to see your information, so you have to trust your VPN to handle your information properly. These are some options for VPN. I was a part of the Library Freedom project this past year, and they highly recommend both that VPN, but all these are other really good options as well. Keeping your information private. Here's a lot of things you can do. Simply lying is a really great strategy that you can employ. And this is called poisoning or assaulting your data. So I just did this on my phone. I gave it a different name. They default to like your name's phone. So my phone's like, oh, it's Ross's phone. Really easily identifiable, right? So use a fake name, use an email address, maybe that doesn't identify you, enter an incorrect or no birth date. Do this for any service whose function is not affected by false information. Um, yeah, this is a way you can fight back, right? And again, voice assistants, cookies, location information. Keep on top of that. These are a lot of things you can do from the settings options in your browsers or your phones. Penn State University has a really great privacy workshop. The personal data plan and digital shred workshop is all included within these links that wonderful Annie Gaines will provide to you. And I also have like some, I have a document I could share with you guys too if you're interested. So privacy workshop, Penn State University, digital shred workshop, excellent, excellent resources. You learn a lot of stuff by going there, a lot of information about surveillance capitalism, as well as things you can do in order to minimize your digital footprint. This is like the big daddy of all of them. It's called the Big Ass Data Broker Opt-out List. It provides an entire list of all the largest data brokers and ways that you can opt out of them sharing your information. I haven't done this yet. It is certainly a goal of mine, but I've heard it takes like anywhere from like 2 to 5 hours to complete entirely. And it's not a one-time thing. Like this is something you might need to do like every twice a year or something like that. And here's some privacy advocates. Library Freedom Project, super cool, amazing people based out of Philadelphia. Two privacy-oriented librarians who offer a lot of services, including the Library Freedom Institute, which is a 15-week intensive course about privacy literacy. It's mostly virtual. They had the option to come to an in-person meeting in Philadelphia in the summer, which I went to. It was really, really fun. Amazing people. I learned so much. And then part of the great part of this is just networking with folks who share your values. And so you can troubleshoot and find ways to solve some issues that you run into. Electronic Frontier Foundation is also another great advocacy program. They have this resource called Surveillance Self-Defense, offers you a lot of really, really good things that you can do in order to minimize your data footprint. They focus on collective, legislative, and grassroots actions. And this is great. I tend to just focus on myself and what I can and can't do. But if collective action is your back, then this is a really good place to go to. There's also a website called Surveillance Watch, which is pretty excellent. It's sort of like watching the watchers. It creates like a map of how all these surveillance companies are connected and what they're doing. And then there's a data detox kit, which is pretty basic ways to minimize your data footprint. So, all right, not too shabby. Here's my contact information. Please reach out if you have any questions, want to collaborate, if you can teach me something, because I certainly don't know it all. So I'd really, really love to hear from you guys. So that's all I have from you, and I'd love to hear any questions if you all have any. I hope I can answer them.
Yeah, thanks so much. Like while folks are forming their questions in the chat, people have been chiming in with other recommendations. So they mentioned
Excellent.
Tor
Yes,
as a good browser to
absolutely.
consider. And Twyla mentioned that if you use a Google phone, it's possible to put an open source operating system on that phone.
So graphene.
Um, yep, Graphene
Yeah,
OS. hmm
excellent.
Yeah. So this
Love it.
seems like your audience. They were right there.
I love it.
And someone else mentioned the EFF before you did. Um,
Nice.
so
Love it.
that's very exciting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So folks, feel free to type in the chat any questions that you have for Ross while we have him. Folks also wanted a list of those books that you mentioned at the beginning. So when I
Oh
send
yeah,
out that follow-up email with a link to the recording, I'll put all your links there and then the list of those books that you mentioned at the beginning as well.
excellent.
Okay. Do you have any resources for alternatives to major social media apps?
Um, my alternative is just to not use them. They're gross, they're bad. And I find like lots of problems with most of them. So like alternatives to social media, man, that's a really great question. I never thought of that because my immediate reaction is to just get rid of them. But I mean, Signal can be kind of like that. I think one Signal chat I'm part of, they kind of use it as their social media. So they'll like share videos, share memes, share links, and all that stuff. So that's certainly an analog. It doesn't have like all the bells and whistles of like your regular social media, but you can kind of turn it into your social media app. So I think Signal's a really good option for that, especially if you get people to use it, get people to download it. It's sort of like it expands the reach of privacy-minded folks, and then you have a pretty private place, a private hub for everybody to engage. I think it's pretty rad. That's a great question.
Do you have recommendations for patron-facing training on this topic? For example, at public libraries, because it seems like
Mhm.
kind of a political issue and
Yeah,
could be a
absolutely.
challenge
Yeah.
in some divided communities.
No, most definitely. I would say like if people are needing to like create an email account, for example, maybe start with, hey, you can create a free Proton Mail account, and explain maybe the value of using that, or insist on just doing a Gmail account because it's easy. Um, I think the big part is like letting people have an autonomy, right? Like we can't control whatever people do. We can give them recommendations, but if they do choose to use Google, maybe give them a quick overview of um, how they work, all the good stuff. It could be even as simple as like privacy or creating your or making your information secure. So, for example, I was helping a person create a Gmail account, and they wanted to make their password something like 123 4. I'm like, oh God, no, like don't do that. So sometimes it's just like baby steps in providing information about being secure and then maybe being more private. And if they're interested, you can kind of um, go that direction. But yeah, the political aspect is really rough. I'm fortunate enough to have a director who's like okay with me promulgating that information. I've created like a little zine that you can that I can share out as well. That you can maybe just put out for people passively to grab. But yeah, I think patron education is really important. So yeah, just suggesting some of these apps without getting into like the weeds, I think would be a great start.
In the chat, I recommended folks check out the resources page offered by the Library Freedom Project because
Awesome.
they've got
Yeah.
like various resources that would be great for a public service type
Mhm.
situation, like tip sheets and talking points and zines and bookmarks
Yeah,
and presentation slides about this topic so that you could take those and adapt them how you need.
definitely.
Uh,
And those
quest
tend to be like really like educational, like, oh, here's what a cookie is and here's what this thing does. And yeah, so yeah, thank you for that, Andy.
mhm. Question, if I understand correctly, we'll receive a recording of this webinar. Is it okay to share it with friends?
Yeah,
Yes, you will receive a recording. It'll be on our YouTube channel, and yes, you can share it with friends. We encourage that. When doing your research, how do credit cards or debit cards function with
Mhm.
privacy?
That's a great question. I don't, I that's a great, that'd be a really cool rabbit hole to go down into. I just know the basic is that like when you do use those, your information is traceable and trackable, right? So like location information, how much you spent, what you spent your money on, that sort of thing, right? So I prefer to use cash. Cash is great, and a lot of businesses really like cash as well. So it's worth it to me to spend time to go to the ATM to get cash. And this is, I think, the biggest sort of shift in all these privacy literacy things is that in order to do these things, it's difficult because it's inconvenient only compared to how we've been conditioned to exist in this world as it is, right? We're sold like convenience, quickness, swift actions, and all this stuff. And this is why we're encouraged not to read privacy policies because they take a long time, right? So just really simple shifts in your behavior can have a pretty outsized influence on how you experience privacy. So even if you go to an ATM, right, they know you're there, it's your bank, and how much money you extract, but the money you spend it on, or the stuff you spend it on, is not traceable. So, but yeah, the deeper details of credit cards and debit cards is interesting, especially that you have like a computer chip in them now. It's like, well, what was wrong with the magnetic strip? Why do we need computer chips now, right? And so, and there's a whole, well, in fact, yeah, there's a whole as far as like your bank account, you not necessarily owning it if something happens, like a government can say like, oh, you're supporting a terrorist organization through, a crowdfunding site, and then they can freeze your bank account and your money is no longer yours, right? So being aware of that not only is it traceable by credit card companies, but if you do anything like crowdfunding online, like governments are going to crack down on that pretty hard based off of their whatever they define as terrorism or national security concerns and all that.
Hmm. And as we've seen, that can change.
Yep, absolutely. It's a it's a fluid definition.
Hmm. About social media, someone recommended Mastodon,
Mastodon, okay.
and other
Um,
small hosted group social medias can be an alternative in some ways, depending on what those needs are.
True. Actually, yeah, you mentioned that. I've never heard of Mastodon. I've heard of Minds, Minds, I think is a thing. I would certainly do your own research with that, just because I just choose not to use those things. But yeah, that might be an option for you.
And also, Matrix is a good
Cool.
alternative to Discord.
Oh yeah. After Discord wants your facial features, right? Oh my
Yeah.
God.
Someone mentions that Proton is very helpful for houseless patrons as it does not
Cool.
require a prior email or phone number for them.
Oh, that's huge. I love that. That is amazing.
Let's see. FYI that the Brave browser's CEO may have questionable politics.
Okay.
Uh, but a yes for the zine. People would love
Cool.
that.
Okay. Awesome.
Um, oh, be aware that Tor continues to be funded and backed by the Department of Defense.
That's true.
Um, Good tool in some situations, but not necessarily a great privacy tool.
Yeah, I think originally created by is was the Navy and the Bureau of something Governors, the BBG. Yeah, so definitely deep ties to the federal government for sure.
Someone says they think the Mulvad VPN lets you pay with cash,
Wow,
which is interesting.
that's great.
Um, and then lots of F's in the chat for Discord.
Yeah.
RIP
Yeah.
to Discord. Um, LibraWolf is a good browser alternative based on Firefox.
Okay.
And then ungoogled Chromium is a good alternative based on Google Chrome. I love
Mm,
the names for these.
that's great.
That's delightful. Like LibraWolf versus Firefox. Great.
I'm learning so much from you guys. This is awesome. So thank you. I really appreciate this.
Oh, and putting your phone in lockdown mode can also help with privacy or security.
True, airplane. And something to be
Um,
aware of too, when I was in Library Freedom Institute. They're pretty like politically focused. That should be like something that you're aware of before you get involved. But they talk about a lot about activism and like crossing borders. And so if you're crossing a border, customs can just seize your phone without a warrant. And so kind of knowing that, maybe delete apps, delete information, or have a phone just for traveling that has nothing on it.
mhm. And I believe like if you have a biometric password, like your face unlocks your phone or your finger unlocks your phone, um, the police can kind of have that happen. But if it's just a number or a sequence of letters and numbers, that is uh, not as easy
Mhm.
for them. So something to think about.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. Uh, you should look into the Fediverse if you haven't yet.
No. What is this?
There's a Wikipedia link.
Okay, I love it.
A collection of social media networking services that communicate with each other.
Okay. I love all the technological like options to combat privacy. I tend to be like, I just like remove those things from my life. That's my approach, but this is amazing. I love it.
Mhm. Oh, Rachel phrased it better than me. Biometrics are not protected by the warrant requirement in the US, only passwords.
Wow.
Do you think self-hosting is a way to go in the future?
Oh, like having your own server and stuff like that. Um, No, this is yeah. I tend to be like a Luddite when it comes to that stuff, so I don't know. That'd be kind of cool. Um, but yeah, and like and again, like I think this is something Zuboff mentions in her book. It's not the technology that's the problem. Part of it is because it enables this, but like it's what we do with it, or it's what the powers that shouldn't be do with it. So um, yeah, if you're able to do that, that would be amazing. Do some sort of like uh, agronomist, like computer farm or something like that.
That sounds awesome.
Oh yeah.
Cool. Okay. I'm not seeing any more questions, and we're also at the top of our hour. Meshtastic, for messaging and privacy. Okay.
Love
But
it.
thank you everybody for attending. Thank you, Ross, for being here to present.